Hi, I'm Alanis Morissette. Welcome to Conversation with Alanis Morissette. It is my pleasure today, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time, to welcome Dr. Bryan E. Robinson. He is an author, psychotherapist, and professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He has authored 30 nonfiction books, including such popular titles as Chained to the Desk, The Smart Guide to Managing Stress, Work Addiction, Hidden Legacies of Adult Children, and Overdoing It, How to Slow Down and Take Care of Yourself, to name only a few. Bryan is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a licensed professional counselor. He maintains a private clinical practice in Asheville, North Carolina, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to the show today. Welcome to the show, Bryan. It's amazing to have you on this show. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Well, I've been looking forward to it as well, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited about talking about workaholism because of the fact that it has been so often swept under the rug, so to speak, in that people don't give it the credence and the focus, really, of how much it can be just as corrosive and just as deeply affecting of people's relationships and lives and health and well-being. To the degree that it is and has been. And I bless you a million times for bringing it into the forefront in the way that you have. Myself, I've been a work addicted person since I was a really young person. And it took me a long time to find ways to enter into recovery around it, to be honest. Food and work addiction were two tough ones for me because I couldn't entirely get rid of both of those. So the idea of sobriety around work addiction was a tough one for me. And my having found your books and having read everything, pretty much every word you've ever written more than once, and then having the pleasure of getting to know you over the years too has been a great gift in my life and has actually saved my life, to be completely honest. So thank you for saving my life.
Oh, wow. That gives me chills. But, I'm a recovering work addict too, and we can talk a little bit about some of my personal experiences and how I got into this. But you're so right. It is such a misunderstood addiction. And I've been on TV shows where I've heard the camera crew laugh in the background when I use the term work addict because it sounded so absurd to them.
And almost like a compliment, right? Like, oh, exactly. Yeah, it's the respectable addiction. It's like, right. If I said, oh, I've done heroin till 4 a.m. last night, there'd be people rallying around me. But if I said I sort of needlessly stayed up working till 4 a.m., people would be patting me on the back.
Exactly. Or if I said I ate a whole chocolate cake yesterday, people would be rolling their eyes.
Or I'd be asking you what kind it was, wanting to join you, but that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
So do you want to tell me a little bit about how you came to name it, what it really is, work addiction, and what led up to you wanting to share this with the people of the planet?
Back in the 80s, there was a movement called Adult Children of Alcoholics that a lot of the listeners will probably remember. Mm-hmm. And every addiction on the planet was mentioned, written about, and spoken about at the conferences except for work addiction. And I knew that was something I had been struggling with, and I couldn't find anything on it. And so I actually had just gone into a family treatment center with a family member who was recovering from alcoholism to help them with their problem. And in the course of the family treatment, I realized I had been using my work in the same way that my family member had been using alcohol. And that's really what got me into that, and the demise of my relationship were the two main things that got me into recovery. And I started, there's of course something called Workaholics Anonymous worldwide, and I started a chapter in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was teaching at the University of North Carolina. So that's how I got started. And then I wrote the first little book called Work Addiction, and it was one of the first books ever really addressing the problem.
Yes, and when I saw it on the shelf, I almost did a backflip because I just thought, finally, there's going to be help for this, the overdoing, and we can get into the definition of it, but I want you to feel complete with you sharing a little bit about your personal experience.
What I realized is that I was doing the same thing, as I mentioned, as my family member had been doing, and I recounted a time at the university. I had been writing books and writing journal articles and doing research and doing community service and teaching, of course. And I realized that when I didn't have that, or during the holidays, that this tremendous anxiety would come up. I remember one day in particular when there was a weekend coming up. It was on a Friday, and I was feeling really anxious because I had nothing planned for the weekend. It was totally open.
Which is so terrifying for a work addict.
That's the word.
Yes.
It's terrifying.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't understand that. But I found in the campus newsletter a call for grants. And I remember taking all that information and folding it under my arm, just like an alcoholic with a bottle, and how calm I felt knowing what my weekend would be.
So some regulation and then some dopamine probably too. Just
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is what workaholism is. It's a form of self-regulation, trying to calm down our nervous system because of things that have happened to us early on in our lives. And they seem so unrelated, but they're not.
Right. And one of the big ones from what I remember in having read your books and worked with you is that it starts really early and it can show up as rushing, like the hurried child, the over busyness. My parents, my parents definitely had a what could be seen from the outside as great passion, know, and a high standard for excellence, etc. Yeah, so it can start really early. And my having been parentified as a kid too, just being told that I was an old soul, and then I seemed much older than my chronological age, and if you could talk a little bit about how you see work addiction starting early on when someone's really young, I'd love to hear some of that.
Sure. You. There are a number of things that we know that starts work addiction, and you've named parentification. And for those who don't know what that means, it's when a child is catapulted into the adult world of responsibility without the emotional construction. And your life is a good example. Gloria Steinem has talked about this. And basically what we do, we're expected to carry these responsibilities, and we kind of have to just do the best we can. But what happens neurologically is something called GHIA, G-H-I-A, Global High Intensity Activation. And the nervous system, because it's not fully constructed, is bombarded with it can be parentification, it can be trauma, it can be family dysfunction. For me, it was alcoholism and a lot of chaos and abuse. So when you don't have the ability to cushion that, then it disrupts the central nervous system. And then as a child, what I did was as soon as I could hold a pencil, I would go into my bedroom and just start writing stories. I would make up these little mystery stories, and I would get these kids into trouble, and then I would get them out of trouble. And it gave me an immense sense of control over this chaotic life that I really had no control over. But that was the beginning of my self-regulation. And then I ended up, in school making really good grades. I wrote the church Christmas play. I acted as Joseph in the church Christmas play. I designed the sets. And everybody was slapping me on the back and telling me how great I was. Right. They had no idea how suffering. On the inside, I was a sad little boy. And
probably hypervigilant too, right? So this global high intensity activation, if it's chronic, that is in and of itself its own trauma.
And it is chronic. Some of us don't realize we have it. And in retrospect, I realized even when I was in college, I would go to parties. I was checking out the safety of the situation. Because when I was a kid, I never knew when my dad was going to come home and tear the house up. Right. So I was always grasping on to ways to protect my little sister and my mother and make sure the house didn't get torn up and that nobody got hurt.
And I try to explain the PTSD aspect of it as well with people sometimes, that the circumstance may not need to be happening. Like I may not need to be chased by people down the street, but that doesn't mean my nervous system isn't walking down the street, either anticipating it or being triggered and reminded of it. Or
That's right. We have a library in our amygdala, right? And something in 2017 innocuous can trigger that amygdala, and we get flooded, and it makes no logical sense, but on an emotional level, we're re-experiencing the trauma from those early years.
And then work was such a praised addiction for me, yo-yoing with food or love addiction or, alcohol or whatever, opiate addiction. All these addictions are often so vilified in a way that I'm already... That in and of itself triggers me too, because I see people as attempting to find relief, and then it sort of segues into I mean, eventually it could kill you, and often it does. But with work addiction, like you just said a moment ago, you get pats on the back, and it's almost like, but I still feel the dysregulation and the shallowness of breath and the restlessness and the suffering, frankly, like I would if I were embroiled in any of my other addictions, mostly, trying to stave off overwhelm or trying to stave off not wanting to feel certain feelings that were overwhelming in my chest, and the little loneliness that can come from the work addiction. But I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the red flags, the 10 red flags that you spoke about in your writings. And one of them that we just touched on briefly was the rushing and the over busyness. Would you in general, Bryan, say that is a really huge indicator of work addiction, in that in the over anythinging, over serving, over helping, over giving, overdoing.
Yes.
It's that word. When I hear the word over something, I just go, ooh, that sounds like my work addiction.
Right. Exactly. I mean, you don't have to be gainfully employed. It could be someone who is home renovating the house, or picking the kids up and trying to get them from one place to another, and cooking dinner. And it's interesting how many times, if we ask our friends or our family, how you doing, how many times they say, oh, we're so busy. And it is becoming a national, and has become a country-wide problem.
Yes.
With people being so busy that they're not really in the present moment. They're in the future or in the past.
Yes.
But what you were asking is one of the red flags is self-neglect, of course, because work comes before everything. So we often don't pay attention to what we eat, or we're eating on the run, or eating bad food. We don't get the sleep we need, because we're working around the clock. And the trifecta of health, of course, is sleep, nutrition, and exercise. And often we don't get the exercise either.
Or the work addiction or workaholism will co-opt the exercising and take
right.
it to the perfectionism, take it to the need, in my case, or in others perhaps as well, the need to control my weight, and just that whole idea of there's so much chaos, so much overwhelm, so much overstimulation for this particular nervous system that I want to control it. I want to control something, right?
Absolutely.
And work is an easy one to think we can control, because, well, we can, and we can control what we put in our mouths, or so we think we can. And
right.
But the more I learn about addiction and my own personal recovery journey, multiple journeys, the more I just see that the neofrontal cortex of the brain just goes offline, and it goes offline
That's
whether
right.
we're using a substance, a process, a person.
That's right. Yes.
And it's no longer there to live by one's own values. Like I might say family is everything, but if I'm in a work addicted binge, let's say, there's no neofrontal cortex that's going to stop me and say, hey, Alanis, you value your family, or you value your friendships, or, so it just kind of disappears, and I go into that addiction mode.
The whole idea of control, which is another one of those red flags, is that if I can control everything around me, it gives me a false sense that everything is going to be okay, or I can predict the future. But it does regulate my nervous system. But it doesn't fix anything. It really becomes the problem that we feel like was going to be the solution. It becomes the surface problem, or the symptom of something deeper.
And we know how fun it is to hang out with people who are trying to control.
Oh yeah,
it's so much fun. Another one is the difficulty with intimacy and some crumbling relationships as a red flag or an indication of the fact that there could be some work addiction in our midst. I hadn't thought about that one until I realized that every single intimate relationship that I had, and some of this is par for the course around being in the music industry and touring, but I realized that all my relationships were my work relationships. And that I hadn't been really cultivating a sort of microcosmic intimacy world of my very own that was personal and micro. So that was another indication for me. And then you also speak about work binges. Can you describe what that might look like?
Yeah, well, a work binge would be when someone has a deadline or a project. Some workaholics wait till the last minute to throw the binge to kind of get that high. And some people do it, a month before. But often binging and working all night, sleeping in their clothes. I've had people tell me that before, that they've slept in their clothes and they wake up just like an alcoholic who passes out. Mm-hmm. But that binge, again, gives that adrenaline, cortisol high that some people are trying to find. And here's the other thing that is also one of the flags, called brownouts.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, brownouts it's a term I've given because I experienced it so much and didn't know what it was. And then when I started working with people who have had them, I started to understand this parallel to alcoholic blackouts. It's a time in which we don't remember conversations with people, or we're driving and we end up somewhere and we don't remember driving there because we're working in our head the whole time, or we're thinking about how to solve a problem with the office, or,
going through our to-do lists.
Yes, the to-do list. But I remember my spouse used to say to me when I'd ask a question, you've asked me that 3 times. And I would say, no, I have not. This is the first. And I've answered it 3 times. Why do you keep asking me that? And I had no clue. Right. But that's an example of a brownout when we actually lose memory.
Yes, I noticed that one happening too. It's almost like I get in a trance. And it's just like a flooding of cortisol too. It's not just dopamine. It's all kinds of stuff,
That's
adrenaline.
Right.
And it just feels like there's this whole chemistry going on in my body that is actually very, very stressful. And it almost begets more stress because that became the set point. That becomes the set point where that level of agitation and stress and restlessness sort of was ground zero. That was a big one. And so it would also make sense that one of the flags could also be just general irritability and impatience, especially if someone was trying to interrupt me or
that's right.
And I would, I'd bark and I wouldn't even recognize myself, like I'm not a barker. I guess apparently I am a barker when I'm in my work addiction mode, and
I'm laughing because it sounds
out of recognition. I know.
Yes.
Yeah. You're not a shamer. I know that, Bryan.
Right.
We laugh at shame.
There's one more thing I wanted to mention that I think it is in my book, but I didn't put it as a red flag. But it's something called work infidelity. Oh. And I don't know if you ever experienced this, but this is when we actually are being deceitful and dishonest and hiding our work.
Yep.
There was a time when my family used to go on vacation to the beach. Mm-hmm. And my whole family would say, you're not taking work. And I would say, okay. Mm-hmm. But I would always find a project when I was teaching at the university, or a book that I was working on, and take those papers and fold them, put them into my jeans, or hide it somewhere under the spare tire in the back, which sounds crazy now.
I'm sorry, that's terrible. I'm gonna use that.
Yeah. But, at the time, it just seemed like the normal, I have to do this. I will go crazy if I don't have it. Mm-hmm. And then we'd get to the beach and everybody would say, let's go walking on the beach. It's so beautiful outside. And I would stretch and say, I'm tired. And they would think, wow, that's cool. He's actually going to rest.
Resting, right.
So they would head off, and once I saw they were out of sight, I would pull out my projects and work feverishly, just like an alcoholic taking a drink, until I saw them coming back, and then I'd lie down on the bed and pretend I'd been sleeping.
Yeah, and that's the infidelity or the deceit, or and exactly. it's to keep it. It's to keep the drug going, right? It's to keep it.
It is, and it's the desperation point too. When if you don't, I've got to have it.
That restlessness. Yeah, it is the fix. And it becomes more and more. And with work addiction, does the tolerance get higher and higher for that level of chemicals coursing through our veins, you think?
Well, it does, if we don't get help for it. I had a woman tell me once that her husband complained because she worked till 7 or 8 at night, and he put the law down. So she said, well, I'm going to take a workout class, and he was thrilled. So what she really did was she worked until 7 or 7:30, and then she took bottled water and doused it on her workout clothes. She changed, put on workout clothes, dashed her workout clothes with water to make him think she had been working. And it wasn't ill-intended. It was it feels like I've got to do this. I can't not do it.
Yeah, it's a compulsion too. And
yes.
I was curious too, the degree to which you think obsessive compulsive disorder itself. I mean, it's just such a compulsion to work or to go through the lists or to, it does become part of a disorder in a way, in the most extreme cases. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, it is. I would call it obsessive compulsive disorder, especially in the extreme cases.
Mm-hmm.
And you had alluded to this earlier, but I want to underscore that it not only kills, literally, it kills people.
Yes.
We don't have a word in our vocabulary in the English language for it, but the Japanese do. They call it karoshi, and that means death from overwork. And these are men and women who work 7 a.m. to 11 at night every day and are dropping dead at their desks in their 40s because of overwork. The closest thing we have is killing time, but that doesn't really get it.
Well, in India, what do they call it? They call it a poison by slow motion.
Yes, a poison by slow motion.
Yeah,
right.
And it's also, stress is one of the number one killers of our human bodies. And
That's
so
right.
some of the physical signs that I have learned from you are headaches, fatigue, allergies, digestion challenges, stomach challenges, ulcers, chest pain, shortness of breath was always a big one for me.
Oh yeah.
As I take a deep breath, I'm dealing with my work addiction while we're talking about this. Nervous tics and some dizziness. I'm sure there's plenty more, but the physical symptoms that show up in a body of someone who's grappling with work addiction. Some of them, again, having started from the time that I was really young. This shortness of breath and under eating, overeating, or whatever it is. And then behavioral signs too, like I said earlier about barking or temper outbursts or this general state of restlessness, if just had this hyperactivity or difficulty relaxing, quickly to be irritable. Forgetfulness was a big one. And ironically, difficulty concentrating for someone who may, myself or anyone who may pride themselves on being so productive, if that's the kind of work addict we are. And we can get into it in a minute about the 4 different kinds of work addicts. But it's on one hand, I can focus like nobody's business. And then on the other hand, I have such difficulty concentrating and I feel like my brain is flooded, and it is,
Yeah, right.
And then the terror for me of boredom, of being hypo-regulated or, boredom was always so terrifying for me. And I think in our family, it kind of wasn't even allowed,
Yeah, right.
And then mood swings, which can segue into mood disorders. So those are some of the more behavioral signs that I've learned from you. But the other thing too that I just wanted to point out is that a lot of the procrastination aspect. So the work binge is one side of the coin as I've experienced it. And I would love for you to speak to this. The work binge or the overworking, the inability to relax. The other side of the coin is that sometimes I get so burnt out. I would get so burnt out that I'd literally not be able to work or write or move. And that procrastination and quote unquote so-called laziness was something that made it seem like I actually wasn't a work addict to the outside eye.
Right.
But it is an actual symptom. Can you speak to that?
Right. I call them this type of workaholism, bulimic workaholism, and it's also known as work anorexia. Mm-hmm. It's a time when folks they're so exhausted and so burned out that they're not able to initiate, until sometimes the last minute. And if there's a deadline, they'll throw a binge, and that's when a lot of people end up sleeping in their clothes or overtaxing their nervous system, but trying to complete something.
Like cramming.com.
Cramming is a great example. Yeah.
So the 4 categories, as you've written about them, that's the bulimic or the work anorexic, or frankly bouncing between the two, right?
Right.
And then there's the relentless work addict, which I think is probably what we may perceive as work addiction mostly, right? High work initiation.
That's the dyed-in-the-wool workaholic, and that would be me.
Okay.
That's someone who, you tell me I have something due in 6 months, and I'll do it tomorrow.
Wow. High
work initiation, get it done now. And you can see how that creates urgency and gets the nervousness, the hurried and the impatience. And so relentless workaholics have high work initiation and high work completion.
And then the savoring work addict.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that.
The savoring work addict is someone who is slow and methodical. They dot every I, cross every T, and they send it back to committee 3 or 4 times, and people who work with them pull their hair out to try to get things through. So they have low work initiation and low work completion. It takes them quite a while because they're the consummate perfectionist.
I was just going to say, that smells like perfectionism.
Oh, yeah.
And then the fourth one being the attention deficit version of work addiction. Tell me a little bit about that one.
Yeah, these are folks who actually sometimes do have ADD because they're great big picture people, very creative, have lots of ideas, but they have trouble completing them, and they often have half-baked projects all over the place.
Like tons of ideas floating all over the place and hard to complete.
Right.
Yeah, and does that sometimes is matched with making sure that there's no accountability. What's that one about? It's about not being able to land. If you could look under the hood on that one with me, what's that one about? The attention deficiency around, is it that other things take precedent over what they've begun, or what does it look like sometimes?
Well, I think these are people who are easily distracted and who their workaholism comes in starting things but not finishing them. And there actually could be some physiological things going on in terms of, their ability to focus. The typical ADD workaholic would be someone who says, okay, I got to sit down and do this project. And then they think, oh, I forgot to turn on the stove for later. And they go turn on the stove, and then they see something needs to be cleaned on top of the stove, and they start cleaning. And they say, now, what was I supposed to be doing?
I don't know what you're talking about, Bryan.
And so they made
I've never heard of this before.
And so they say, oh, I'll finish that tomorrow then. I'll go back and get with it later tomorrow. So.
And there's so many ways to deceive one's own self too around excuses with work addiction. For me, in my experience, I could just say that, I'm just a multi-potentialite. I just have so many things. I just get overwhelmed and around that fourth version.
Yep.
It's easy to hide. It is, in my opinion, one of the easiest addictions to hide. And it is one of the most corrosive, because that cortisol streaming through your body chronically is just going to take us down.
Of course, it sure will. The body bears the burden. No matter which category you fall into, the body is going to bear the burden of the overworking and as you mentioned, the cortisol adrenaline cocktail that we flood ourselves with, or that we stew in.
And then I also notice how that whole whack-a-mole addiction thing happens so often in, especially, like I was going to say, especially in the entertainment industry, but it's everywhere. But I noticed that if someone publicly declares, I've stopped drinking or whatever they're bravely attempting to, or in the midst of recovering from, it's like all of a sudden, okay, I'm not drinking, but I worked till 3 a.m. for 9 days in a row.
Right.
And this work addiction, it can be so, again, it's so praised that someone will say, well, good for you. Your productivity has come back. And then all of a sudden we're attaching our worth and our value to outcomes and products and achievements. And, and then heaven forbid there's a break. Like in my case, coming off tour was like coming off the drug. And I would almost, I'd be debilitated. I have photos of myself lying in front of the fireplace after any given long tour, and my friends or my roommates at the time would literally take photos, and they'd slip me soup, and I'd go to the restroom, and I'd stay in the same position for 3 days. And I guess that's the hangover, right?
It sure is. Withdrawal coming off the drugs.
Yes. And the withdrawal is like, it's hard. Would you describe a little bit of what you've experienced with your patients and clients, or even with your own self, around what the withdrawal feels like or looks like?
For most people, myself included, it's a fogginess, it's an irritability, it's inability to focus, but feeling like I need to, get back in the game and get things going, and I can't.
Like passionlessness, passionlessness,
exactly. Yeah, passionless, exhaustion,
depression.
It can be depression. And I've talked with some who've been so depressed they haven't been able to get out of bed. It can be a severe depression.
That was me sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I find that interesting because there's so many really brave people in the industry that are coming out about abuse and trauma, and work addiction is something that they themselves fall into when they're trying sobriety in various areas of addiction. And all of a sudden this work addiction one doesn't look so scary, and it doesn't scare everyone around them. So it almost perpetuates that one rearing its head in a way.
That's a big concern I have as a psychotherapist. I see a lot of other psychologists and psychotherapists who actually prescribe work for people who've been in treatment in order to, or people who haven't been in treatment, who are going through a rough time. Focus on work, get busy, find something to do.
Right. Write another record, go on tour again,
Right.
And then how it's inextricably linked with finances too, because some people are actually, you distinguish this in your writings, the difference between a hard worker versus a work addict, and how you can, with your experience, how you can tell the difference. If you want to speak to that for a moment.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point, Alanis. A lot of people, when we talk about workaholism, their first comment will be, what is wrong with hard work? And that's not what we're talking about. Hard work put us on the moon. The best way I know how to distinguish the two is a hard worker is in the office dreaming about being on the ski slopes. And a workaholic or a work addict is on the ski slopes dreaming about being back in the office.
You got to make a postcard of that one.
I know. I love that. Yeah. But that just boils it all down. The work addict is, even if they're not working, they can be working in their mind while they're playing catch with one of their kids or carpooling somewhere. That's what true workaholism is. It's not just doing it in the moment. It's work. It's the inability to turn it off.
It's preoccupation, right? Like
exactly. Yes.
Yeah. There are times where my poor husband, where we'd be silent for an hour, and he'd walk up and ask a question, and I'd be so upset because I was in the middle of working, but to him, I was just sitting there quietly enjoying the trees,
right.
But I'm just like, no, I'm in the middle of I'm in the center of the project that I'm working on right now. And he's like, well, how do I know? Well, just look at the look in my eyes.
The other thing that really disturbs me is when we're talking about the lack of education around this, is when I see experts come on shows to talk about what workaholics need to do to balance their life. They inevitably will say, oh, get a hobby, cut back on hours.
As though that's an easy thing to do.
Well, it has no effect.
It's like telling an alcoholic to stop drinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or telling a food addict, don't eat that piece of cake.
Yeah.
It's surface. It doesn't really get to the issue at all.
Exactly. And we were touching on, I just want to tie the bow on the idea too of the difference between working hard and work addiction. Yeah. There are some circumstantial situations where people, want to make ends meet, and they take 2 full-time jobs on, and they're just like, you know what? Externally, I might look like a work addict, but I'm doing this to put food on the table. I'm doing this to take care of my family, to provide and to protect. Yeah. And a quote that I love of yours is, true workaholics are driven by deeper internal needs rather than by external ones.
Exactly. In other words, the supermarket does not create food addiction. The ABC store does not create alcoholism. And the workplace does not create workaholism. It's something we bring. So when we're talking about, say, the tax accountant in the spring before taxes are due working hours on end, that's not workaholism. Or the single mom who has to work 2 jobs to support her family, that's not necessarily workaholism.
Right.
That's something that is created out of circumstantial demand.
Right.
Although there are situations in certain workplaces where
the climate
yes, the climate of the workplace can actually create some of the similar effects that workaholics have, that they bring. But generally speaking, work addiction is an internal landscape that we workaholics bring to the job. It's not something that gets created. Although the workplace, if it's an inhumane workplace, can create conditions that can create a lot of stress in people that simulate work addiction.
Right. And is it true, do you think, that it would make sense that a work addict would be attracted to a place that was filled with, hurriedness and intense deadlines? And I mean,
like flies on you know what.
On what, yeah. Bryan?
I don't know if I can say that.
You're
word.
So proper. How about moth to a flame?
That's good. Moth to a flame.
But yeah, I really do. It just bears repeating just for my own brain. Talk about not being able to concentrate. True workaholics are driven by deeper internal needs rather than by external ones or external situations or circumstances or financial requirements, it's almost like I was a magnet for other work addicts, I could spot them a mile away. I know this person would be willing to work with me on this time on, this person would be with me through 42 interviews during the day. I used to do interviews on tour to the point where I was slurring my words, and my tour manager would shoot me a look of concern. Like, are you okay? Are you having a neurobiological shutdown right now? And I would give him a look of like, I just need 10 minutes and I can do the rest of the interviews. And I've had a couple of intervention moments from people with whom I've worked who were very mercifully and very pointedly kind enough and generous enough and empowered enough to say, we're worried about you, and they asked me to write down everything that I was working on, every project, whether it was in the middle, the beginning, the end, floating, and at one point the list was like 56 things, and then they challenged me to bring it down to 5, and I laughed uproariously. I was just like, are you kidding me? Yeah. You're taking my drug away. No way.
Right.
But the whole idea of moderation and sobriety within work addiction, I'm sort of moving toward the recovery conversation. If you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit to what sobriety might even begin to look like, or the balance you speak of.
I'll share I just had a little pang of shame as I was listening to you, because I remember many, many years ago, my spouse on knees begging me to spend time. Mm-hmm. And I was furious. How dare you interfere with my important work? I was writing a textbook at the time, and oh man, when I look back on that, I just realized how lost I was swimming around in this addiction. Yeah. And of course, we've made amends and we've worked on that. But can I say one more thing before we get into the recovery about it's a family disease, just like alcoholism is a family disease, and it affects. Actually, when I was at the university, I did a lot of research, and I did the first study. My research team and I led did the first study on. Believe it or not, there was no research on workaholism.
No, I believe it.
Addiction. Yeah,
I believe it.
And we did the first study on the effects of work addiction on marriage. Yeah, and we did the first study on the effects of work addiction on children. Nobody had even looked at it because they didn't consider it a problem. They, as you said, that it was extolled. People who are workaholics are extolled. Mm-hmm. What we found was in marriage, greater disaffection and emotional disconnect. And we found a 40% increase in divorce among workaholic marriages compared to non-workaholic marriages. Nobody had ever looked at it. But the other thing with the kids is we found the children of workaholics tend to be more anxious, have more depression, and what we call external locus of control, which means they feel like they're not in control of their world, that it's in control of them.
Which could beget eating disorders or some version of attempting control.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I just want folks to understand it's an individual problem for the workaholic. It's a problem in the marriage. and it's a problem that gets passed on to children.
The legacy.
It's damaging, exactly.
And then contextually, I mean, we're on a planet.
Yeah.
It's like trying to describe feminism without taking into account patriarchy for me. It's like we're on a planet that extols the virtue of overwork. Mm-hmm. And so I just think it is the most rebellious act to seek moderation and sobriety within work addiction.
I love that.
In a world that basically tells you your worth is associated directly with your output and your productivity and your achievements.
With what you do.
Yeah.
Right.
And not who you be.
Right. And I just want everybody to know we're not saying become a slacker or don't work hard. That we're talking about balance and moderation. Yeah. And that's the key to recovery. Now,
although the sloth is my spirit animal, but no, but moderation is the key, and with recovery, and we can bounce back and forth. By the way, it's not we don't have to compartmentalize the recovery talk and then the challenging aspect of this.
Okay,
would you call it a disease? By the way, would you call work addiction?
Yes, I would call it a disease of the mind.
Of the mind.
Think about it this way: if an anorexic person is standing in front of a mirror, she might see herself as fat. Yes. If you and I are standing there looking at her, we might gasp at how thin she is. Mm. So workaholics have that same. I'd like to call it. Well, I'd like to call it work dysmorphia, except it just doesn't. That phrase doesn't work.
Well, but it works for me.
Does it?
I like it. Yeah, it's the same thing.
It's the same thing. It's a form of distorted thinking. We think we're not working that much, and so when our loved ones say you've got to cut back, we're in denial. We'd say, what are you talking about? I've got to get food on the table. I've got to send the kids to college. Yes. I'm not working all that much. Or
I haven't even done anything today. How it would show up for me often is someone would say, so what were you up to today? And I said, I didn't do anything. Meanwhile, I would have done 52 things, and I would have checked off everything on the list. And yet somehow within my body, I felt as though I did nothing. What's that?
I've had so many times in my past, in the throes of my addiction, when I would end a day early and think, "Gosh, I haven't done anything."
Yeah, I'm so useless.
Yeah, useless. I need to go do something else now.
Right.
When in fact it had been a full day compared to what most people
would consider.
Had done.
Right.
Exactly. So we can talk about, this whole thing of doing nothing, being a human being instead of a human doer. The Italians have a name for it. We don't even have this in our vocabulary.
Not in America. Not in North America.
Yeah, and I don't speak Italian, but it's something like il dulce far niente, and it means the sweetness of doing nothing. Aww. Having idle moments without imperative. Yeah. So you're taking that in.
Yeah, that's so sweet.
I am too, actually. It's something I've learned to do. In fact, I pat myself on the back. Yesterday, I waited for someone for 4 hours. I waited, and I was calm, and I had my dogs with me, and I watched people, and I did nothing except wait. Which 10 years ago,
yeah, you would have been out after 11 minutes, right?
I would have been going
in a
crazy.
rage.
I would have been white knuckling it, to say the least.
Yeah. Eckhart Tolle says that somewhere in his writings too, where he says someone would ask, he was sitting there and someone would ask him what he was doing. Are you waiting? Who are you waiting for? And he said, I'm not waiting. I'm just being here.
I love it.
I'm like, yeah. It's true. Yeah. It's easy for people to say, stop and smell the roses, but the degree to which work addiction can take a hold of your mind and your nervous system and your biochemistry is so underestimated.
That's right.
And there's a lot of people that will shame their spouse or their friends, for never being able to be around and being almost addicted to heavy deadlines and chaos. And I have so much empathy for the relief that actually provides for the person, and that there's anxiety and agitation often when that chaos is not present, or that, that chronic hypervigilance.
That's right. What happens there, if we're talking about recovery versus active addiction, when we're in active addiction, workaholics anyway, our sympathetic nervous system is running the show. And for those listening, the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response. I call it the gas pedal. But in recovery, what we do is we bring in the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest response. It's the brakes. So we have the gas pedal and the brake pedal, but work addiction is when you're going 90 miles an hour, changing tires. And so part of recovery is engaging in parasympathetic activities, which calm down the nervous system. And there's something called neuroplasticity now, and there's tons of research coming out around this, showing that we can actually change the brain. So over time, I think this is one of the things that allowed me to wait for 4 hours yesterday, which I would not have been able to do.
You're rewiring your brain?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Over time, because I meditate, I do yoga, I do a lot of little exercises that are coming out of the neuroscience now that I'm actually teaching to clients of mine.
The mindfulness.
And it's a form of mindfulness. They're simple little exercises. I have a client right now who meditates 5 minutes a day, and it has changed his entire life. And when we talk about meditation, people think about, oh my gosh, I don't have time.
Or that they somehow have to stop the thoughts,
Exactly.
And as Byron Katie says, those thoughts are thinking you, and those spaces between can get larger and longer, and, but somehow there's also this erroneous message out there that we're the ones that are sticking the thoughts in our heads, and we're the ones, and that we're the problem, and that is the complete opposite of what will help the recovery process, which is how to navigate or how to be still in the midst of it, and also bringing in this neuroplasticity brain conversation and the regulation concept. I mean, I'm just so excited about how integrated the healing arts and the healing sciences and the healing, doctors, frankly, around the planet are really integrating the brain and the biochemistry and the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And for me, it's all kind of coming together with this big piece being that work addiction be recognized for what it is, and how it can be hidden and misinterpreted or like we've said a few times, congratulated, and I just thought, and I'd be congratulated so often during times where I was in the deepest amount of suffering. I'd be winning awards, or I'd be losing a ton of weight and super anorexic, and people would say, "You look great," and congratulations. And meanwhile, I'd be dying inside, And so that was a tough one. But the recovery aspect of things, I'm really, really inspired by having read so much and learned so much directly from you about what recovery looks like with work addiction. And one of the ones that you shared with me was the watertight compartments and allowing yourself to have transitions between them. And transitions are something that is a big theme in our family, and it can make the difference between me coming home as a mom with a ton of attention and undivided attention for my kids, or cranky as I'll get out. So giving myself the transition time to take some deep breaths and do some of the regulation and reach out to some of my resources, whatever they are, and they're personal to everyone. I'd be curious, what some of your recommendations are for resources or for regulation that are some of your favorites, if you don't mind sharing a couple.
Sure, glad to. Well, I call them time cushions. There was a time when I could be at the university and teach a class and then have another commitment starting right as the class ended, which is 10 miles away. So again, it's that stinking thinking or distorted thinking. We don't think about putting the relaxing or the cushion time between appointments. So that's one thing, is giving ourselves time to get from one place to another,
and factoring it into the calendar, right?
Exactly. Literally writing it down.
Yeah.
Because that helps the brain really take it in, as opposed to just thinking about it.
Drive right into the next one. And also how the sneaky, for me, it's, if I give myself the 15 minutes or the 10 minutes or even the hour, what am I doing during that hour? I remember some people saying to me, we gave you these 3 days off for you to recharge. These were my fellow work addicts. We gave you these 3 days off to recharge, and you come back just as depleted. I'm just like, well, it's like, sending me as an alcoholic, sending me into a bar to have a little break. It's like, my own mind. I couldn't even trust my own mind. I couldn't trust. It's not so much I couldn't trust my own mind, but it was that I couldn't trust myself. To not OCD with all the projects and all these ideas. And I would couch it as, oh my gosh, I have another idea and another project and another record idea and multimedia, and it just keep coming, and there'd be this mania almost to it.
Well, one thing I've noticed, that the good news is in my recovery, contrary to 10 years ago, I look forward to weekends with nothing planned, open time. That's one of the biggest things I've noticed in my life that before would have terrorized me. But having open-ended time, having another thing that I do is in those time cushions is I have a big tree outside of my office. Sometimes I'll just sit and look at the squirrels running up the tree, or sometimes take a walk around the block. So anything that gives you energy and takes your mind or helps you get out of your mind, your thinking mind.
Right.
There's another knowing. And one of the things we learn in recovery is the brain is a wonderful thing, but there is another knowing that we're discovering when you talk about integration of medicine and neuroscience and psychotherapy, and that is the heart. There's an old saying that the longest trip we must take is the 18 inches from the head to the heart. And recovery is really about finding that heart speak and being able to be more intimate, being able to feel our feelings that have been frozen for so long, and being able to share those with people we love. And may sound easy for some people who are listening, but for a work addict, that's a big
agitation.
Challenge. Yeah.
That's sheer terror.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so the time cushions could look like what? If you have a few examples, like if someone were to give themselves a time cushion, could it be them sitting in the car, shutting the car off and just taking some deep breaths before entering into their home or into their other roles? Yeah.
It could be something we call grounding, where I just notice if I'm sitting in the car or sitting in my office, I notice the seat beneath me and just notice the sensations I feel as I notice the seat or the back of the chair I'm sitting in. It brings us more into our body.
So like somatic awareness.
It's a somatic awareness. And what that does, all of a sudden you start to notice a calming on the inside.
Yeah. And I never knew when I started trauma recovery and did a lot of somatic work, I just thought, as a work addict, of course, my first thought was, oh my God, this is a waste of time. It's just going so slowly. And who cares that I can feel my feet? Who cares that it feels like there's a whirlwind in my stomach? Let's just get something done, Yeah. And then over time, frankly, over years, I started to see that there was a direct correlation between my work addiction recovery and my somatic proprioceptive awareness. And if I could feel and sense whether it turned into a visual of a color or a sensation or a temperature, the more I was able to do that, it wasn't a waste of time. It was a regulating mechanism for me.
Exactly.
And
I have people who say that to me too. I don't give a shit about that stuff.
Exactly.
But really, it's resetting the nervous system.
Yeah.
Is what it does. And once you've had the experience, people are amazed.
Yes.
They're amazed that something that simple can make
bring
a
you
difference.
home. Yeah.
Your internal landscape.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to say about recovery is it's really clear for alcoholics or people who are on drugs or gambling.
Narcotics and all of it.
You just stop. But most people can't just stop working.
No.
So we talk about a work plan, or I call it a self-care plan, where we try to achieve abstinence or moderation, but it's not about giving up work. It's just looking at, I talk about 4 quadrants. There's work, there's relationships, there's self, and there's play. And under self, that includes spiritual development, eating, sleeping, just self-care kinds of things. And if you look at just those 4 areas and ask yourself, what percentage of time and energy do I put into each one? And just write that down, and it has to add up to 100%. If you're a true work addict, you will see that most of your time and energy is going into that quadrant.
Right.
And it can give you a clue on what are some things you can do to increase the self-care or improve your relationships, or
and also the play part too for work addicts, and I think a lot of addicts as well, defining what fun is, as a parentified sort of tiny little person who was trying to, I had a record company at age 10 and was just being the therapist for people 3 times, 5 times my age when I was single digit age. And I just remember looking out the window and seeing my friends running around and bicycling, and I was inside doing some project or some work. And I just remember thinking that somehow I couldn't access that fun, even as an adult now. And I'm in active recovery on so many levels for so many things. The idea of really defining what fun is, and that it requires me to have a real grasp of what my essential self is. Because if I'm working, or I'm choosing a career, or I'm winning awards in order to please mommy or daddy, or please society's expectations of the American dream for me, or whatever's projected upon me, then I'm basically cutting off and denying and splitting my essential self away. And I almost lost complete touch with what she was, and had great shame about it, the fact that and so with the reemergence of the authentic self, or the essential self, so many great names for it, I started to realize what I actually personally found to be fun. And that was one of the biggest challenges for me, even when I first came across your work, was this play thing. I was like, well, I play sports like really ruggedly, and I'm an athlete, and I spin like a spin meister, So, but everything was co-opted by this sort of work addictive approach to life. So for me to get into the rest and not be agitated, and to learn to play and have fun and just revel in nowadays, watching my daughter paint something with water on the cement, I'm just blissed out, and I get lost in it. And I would not have been able to do that even 5 years ago, to be honest.
Yeah. And deep play is when, again, we're able to just, it could be browsing in a bookstore. It can be, we have to learn to play again. At least I did, because I didn't get to play as a child. Life was too serious. And you're bringing up something that's really important for balance and recovery, and that is, what is fun to each of us, and how do we play, and it's a form of letting go. And you can see letting go, if we're playing and having fun, we're letting go, which is contradictory to controlling, right? Waiting for the next shoe to drop. So it takes some time and some insight and some practice in being able to do that. But sometimes it can just be being silly with someone you feel safe with. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It can just be able to let go with someone and just be yourself. And
comedy's great for that one.
Yeah, yes,
watching
absolutely.
Funny movies and.
Right.
I also think too, in agreement with what you just said about it doesn't have to look like some grandiose thing. Reading a book for me is really, really, really fun.
Yeah.
It's like, and I was always ashamed of that, and people I remember in Germany, we were on this road trip, and we went around the bus talking, asking questions of everyone. And we said, we asked, what's the most fun thing for you to do? And one person would say, jet skiing. And I was like, organizing. They're like, what? I'm like, no, puttering, straight up puttering is one of the most joyful things. And now part of the work addiction thing for me, and I was trying to find different words to use to express it, is that I would just do too much. So my puttering would turn into sort of OCD, cleaning the whole house. That's when I would notice that I was dipping into work addiction, where it started out fun, and then it's not fun anymore, but I keep going. So can you speak to that little turning point? Is that just no boundary, no limit, no no sense of I mean, I could actually physically sense it now when something starts off as really fun and convivial and everyone's having a ball, or I'm having a ball, and then all of a sudden it's arduous, and yet I keep going, and is that a symptom as well of work addiction?
Well, I think it's a form of relapse that kind of sneaks up on us. It's baffling and cunning, just like any other addiction. I know that in many, many of my relationships, friendships, I've turned them into work. Colleagues, who I say, let's write a book, or let's do a
project of some kind, right?
Some kind of project, yeah. Or let's form a group therapy around that topic or whatever.
Yeah.
I try not to do that now, but it's there's a fine line between getting high and getting excited.
Yes.
And a lot of workaholics get a little nervous about, well, where's that line? And I don't want to go over it. I don't want to get the adrenaline and the cortisol stew again. But
it's that resilience zone too in the middle. Speaking of the parasympathetic and sympathetic, so for me, what I have to be careful of is, in speaking to what you just said about, is this me seeking the high, or is this me just, having a little rise in my, in my nervous system?
That's right.
And I can tell, because to be perfectly honest, if I'm to describe it, the high is piercing, and it can be painful, and when it's just a rise, it feels so mature. It feels so grown up and so moderate, and this balance that you speak of attempting to reach in the recovery from work addiction, with it being the tough one, because abstinence oftentimes is not entirely possible. So to find that balance, you also wrote in one of your books about the balance being, you notice that you're not sacrificing. I remember that being really touched by that sentence that you wrote. And that's probably a good indication too. Would you think that the second you start feeling like you're sacrificing something, whether it's your physical well-being or your sleep or your relationship qualities or the degree of intimacy, I mean, that when it starts to feel like a sacrifice is usually an indication of contraction in my chest, and then I go, okay, now I'm in my illness. Yeah.
And I have a part of me when that happens that I call it the rebel part of me that gets really pissed. And
pissed at what?
The fact that I'm sacrificing.
Oh yeah, like resentful.
There's a resentful part that comes up.
A little Karpman triangle.
Yeah.
God bless it. And one thing that I would love to end on, if you feel ready to, is that this is just a beautiful, simple sentence that you said, that the balance would look like joy at work and at home, and that there'd be an equal gratification or joy that would be gotten from both circumstances. Woo-wee.
Yeah. And I think that's different from being high, is joy. It's a different feeling.
Beautiful. Yeah. And then the undercurrent of all of this for me is any sort of abuse or neglect or trauma, how much it feeds our desire for relief. I really do see addiction as, we're well-meaning, and we're just seeking relief, and then the method through which we seek that relief just takes over our whole lives and leads us towards certain death, unless there's some intervention of some kind. So, and
it's temporary; it's not sustainable.
And I used to say, "Well, I'll take the 20 minutes. I'll take the 20 minutes."
In the short term, it's great, but in the long term, we suffer more over time.
Yeah.
Can I mention one more thing?
Of course.
About Workaholics Anonymous?
Yes, please.
Can I give the website?
Absolutely. You can do anything you want.
Oh, okay. Well, there is a Workaholics Anonymous that's similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, where folks work the 12 steps around work addiction. And the website is www.workaholics-anonymous.org. And a lot of people say to me, well, we don't have WA in our town. Well, you can go online on this website, and they have meetings all over the world. And you can click, and all the information is there. So the help, if someone is listening and they really need help with this and they can't find a therapist. And I get calls all the time from all over the world, people asking me where they can get help. This is one place that everybody can, if they have a problem, even whether you're a workaholic or the family member of a workaholic, and you can get help there. There's also something called Work Anon for family members, similar to Al-Anon.
Wow.
So I just want everybody to know about that resource. There's also a test that I developed called the WART. This was back when I was doing the research, WART, Work Addiction Risk Test, which can actually tell you if you're a workaholic or not. It's being used, again, all over the place for free. I don't charge for it. But if you want to take the test, you can actually go to my website, BryanRobinsonOnline.com, and take the test, and it will score it in just a few minutes, and you'll get your score, and it'll tell you where you fall in the categories. But it's BryanRobinson online.com, and again, it'll give you immediate feedback. That website also has resources for folks, books and other things to help folks deal with this insidious addiction.
Well, God bless you, Bryan. I am, my heart is bursting right now. It's almost been like the planet's dirty little secret that we've been polishing, and I wasn't kidding at the beginning of our call when I said that meeting you and taking in your work has saved my life, and it's saved my relationships. And I just wish for this support to be available to anyone who needs it. And I just want to offer so many blessings to you for, this is not for the weak of heart. The fact that you just kept going for it. It's almost like your work addiction helped you solve work addiction.
Yeah, it's a paradox.
Yeah,
in some ways
lovely
it did.
Paradox. Yeah, and so I'm sorry for the challenging suffering aspect of that, but God bless you for the light side of it, the perseverance and the deep, meaningful service that you've provided through creating and speaking publicly about recovery from work addiction. God bless you.
Well, thank you, Alanis. And I have to say the same to you. I think this is going to help a lot of people, and I really appreciate all that you do to let people know about this addiction and providing understanding and help for the people who need it. God bless you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Alanis.
Yeah, bless you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. It's a joy to share these podcasts with you. I invite you to subscribe and join me on the next podcast. And until then, take care, and I'll see you soon. Conventional, kid, all intense.